Reporters for Vice News travel the world, putting a human face to the world's most important stories.
There's a solid wall of riot police officers.
But now, we introduce you to them.
They're doing CPR on one of the casualties here. We don't know if he's going to make it.
This is Field Notes, a show that sits down with our reporters to find out the stories behind their stories and how they got so close to the action.
Feeling pretty good about that?
In this episode, we hear from the team that was there as some of the millions of people forced from their home in Ukraine crossed into Poland, seeking refuge as the country was invaded.
Go!
Навіть те, щоб бігти з домівок, це, мені здається, не настільки страшно, як просто вбивати людей, стріляти по мирних людях, в їхні будівлі. Виправдання цьому нема ніякого.
Ні, папи нету.
Що, якого вибираєш?
Я.
Тримай.
Thank you guys for joining me today and for the coverage that you've been doing about the humanitarian crisis as people are fleeing Ukraine. Val, I want to start with you. As you were filming this, situation on the ground was changing. More attacks were happening. This was an escalating situation. What was it like to talk to people as they were coming out of Ukraine, as they were hoping to find refuge somewhere?
Yeah, I think that as we arrived and by the time we left, the amount of displaced people from Ukraine coming into Poland had just nearly doubled. So it was just like developing as we were there and sort of seeing all the systems in place also develop. I'm talking about humanitarian aid and just like groups of people and volunteers, like even that was becoming more organized as we were there. And so it was like a very interesting thing to be there as it happened. I think that talking to people as they sort of crossed the border into Poland was like a very difficult process because these people, have just experienced something really real and really scary and traumatic. And, they're coming off the border and it's sort of my job to ask them what they're feeling. And like, there's a lot of sort of ethical gymnastics that I was playing with myself about like, what's the best way to approach this? What's the correct way? We made sure that to always ask permission of people and sort of engage with them to see if they wanted to share their story. And like, truth be told, a lot of people didn't, and a lot of people did. So I think that it was just like a very different situation that I'm used to. And I thought it was it's very different to report in an evolving environment, but also very interesting.
Jika, Madeline, was it similar? Was it hard to sort of keep up with the news as it was happening, to hear it from people as they were experiencing it? What was it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's you're getting 1,000 notifications on your phone while you're there, and so, but I think sometimes it's more just concentrate on who you have in front of you, and things are developing, and we'll report on that, and that'll be put into the story. But while you're there, focus as much as you can on this one story of the millions of stories that are coming across the border.
Right.
That's always kind of the thing I try to just keep on, which is not always easy to do, especially when things are moving so quickly.
Mm-hmm. And it's Madeline, it seems like the people you talk to maybe roughly fit into a few categories: those fleeing, those coming back into Ukraine to fight, and those who weren't sure whether they had anything to come back to. How did you approach the story knowing it was going to be changing so much as you were doing it? How did you approach people to try to talk to them about their experiences? And what did you learn?
Yeah, I mean, it was a different experience that we weren't able to cast for anybody or speak to anybody in advance. So we really had to figure things out on the ground. Something that really helped was that Val could approach people speaking Russian, and Russian and Ukrainian are similar enough that it would kind of like make the conversation more intimate more quickly, and we could really like get people to trust us and develop a better relationship with them. And through doing that, it helped us evolve our production more quickly than other teams that were only working in English, for example. It was difficult because we got there and we didn't exactly know where to go. Like, we knew where the border was, and then just from speaking to people there, we had to put together the process of like, what happens after you cross the border? Oh, you take a bus to this train station. Once you get to this train station, oh, you take another train to Warsaw or someone picks you up. So while we were talking to people, we were putting together the pieces of their journey and making sure that we kind of were understanding each person's individual experience, but also what their process was going to be for the next 24 hours, the next week, or even the next few months.
And that was evolving as you were there, I imagine, right? Like
Exactly,
the,
yeah.
The response to the humanitarian crisis was evolving as the humanitarian crisis was escalating.
Yeah, and there was also, every day they would close down access to certain things. So some days we would get to a location and there were a lot of cameras and we could film. Some days they were like, oh, you can't go back here. So every time we were in a place, we had to really make sure that we were getting it because we didn't know if we could go back there.
Val, I want to pick up on speaking Russian and how that may have helped communicate with people as they were crossing, as they were trying to find a safe place to be. And so how did you use your language skills to help try to elicit some of these human stories?
It was like a really beautiful experience to be able to use my native language to connect with people. And I think that just speaking to them in Russian, a lot of times they would say, and this would be like sort of a political statement, they would say like, I can speak Russian and I can understand it, but I'd prefer to speak in Ukrainian with you. Is that okay? And I would say, yeah, of course. Like my grandfather's Ukrainian. I grew up hearing it, like I could understand it. And so it was this like really sort of beautiful exchange of language because I would be asking in Russian. Sometimes they'd respond in Russian. Other times they'd respond in Ukrainian. And I think it built this sort of trust. And I think that being able to not have a translator and just speak with them sort of created this fluidity and openness of conversation that I think sometimes lacks when people have, like a third person trying to sort of translate everything and breaks up the flow of like a natural thought and conversation. So I thought it was really an incredible learning experience to be able to use that. And I also think something I noticed, and we talked about this while we were filming, is that a lot of crews who only had English speakers would come up to these people and sort of start speaking to them in English and say, like, do you speak English? Like, can you understand me? And what would happen is that I felt that there was this sort of like bias towards younger people from more metropolitan cities who would respond and say yes. And so sort of the like diversity of sources changed. And I saw that time and time again that like a lot of crews were sort of talking to younger people from Kiev, let's say, and then we were able to speak to people that weren't necessarily from that demographic. And I think that was really important.
Right, and I mean, we're talking about millions of people who are fleeing, and so kind of the forced selection of only talking to people who can speak English necessarily changes the story. The point what really hit me about how useful and how much the story was enriched by your language skills was when you're talking to the musician, the man who was coming back to Ukraine to fight, and he had military experience, but you could see in that moment, like you realized, like, wow, there's something really poetic and poignant about this person who practices the arts going back to like trade a guitar in for a gun, basically,
It honestly took me a few seconds because he was speaking in Ukrainian, and there's a bit of a lag when people speak in Ukrainian to me. And when I realized that he was talking about being a musician, it sort of just like, it really, really struck me. And he was sort of talking about like the notes of war and the notes of trauma. And I was like, just like what a poetic thing to say. And so yes, that moment was really just like impactful for me as someone asking him this question and just like hearing in his voice that like maybe he wasn't necessarily prepared, but he was ready. And I think that was, it was just an astonishing moment.
And another moment that struck me in the same way was when the mother of one of the children said, like, my father was a child of war, and now my child is going to be a child of war. And that kind of speaks to sort of a bigger picture, Madeline, about just how many people now in this region, of course there are other places around the world where there is warfare, but here between Russians and Ukrainians will become children of war.
Yeah, and we heard that time and time again, and I think it was also because Val was speaking Russian, she was able to speak with children more directly too and kind of like engage with kids in a more authentic way. But what we heard from parents was that they had grown up hearing their parents tell them stories about living through war, and they were kind of coming to terms with having to talk to their kids about it and what that was going to be like for their kids, especially a couple days out if they had been sleeping at the train station for a while, like imagining that they weren't actually going to get home as soon as they thought they would. Like, I think some people came over or across that border and were like, we'll just be here for a couple of weeks, we'll ride it out, and then we'll go home. And then we increasingly met people who were like, my apartment was destroyed, I have nowhere to go back to. And those parents with kids having to understand that they're going to build a whole new life in Europe. Their child might not get back to Ukraine for many years, as we kind of like look down the barrel of this very long military engagement, likely. So it was pretty powerful to be with parents in a moment where they were considering how drastically their children's lives were about to change.
Yeah, and Jika, I want to ask you about sort of another larger picture question about human migration writ large. You've covered migration in the Americas quite a bit. And then as someone who holds a camera, who uses cinematography as a way to tell the story, like what are you paying attention to try to tell those stories, to try to tell that kind of human story in a time of crisis that people are going through? Because I think you do it so effectively. Like I really feel little moments that are observational.
I mean, the similarity is people are just people. It's moms and dads trying to get their kids out of harm's way and trying to be able to care for them and get to a safe place, right? So, you know, the need of people that need to survive and just figure it out and keep moving forward and being stoic. But also I realized, you know, paying attention to just body language and facial expressions. There's this one bit that's at the end of our piece, which is at night by a fire with this mom and her kid. And I just went up to her and pointed at my camera and was like, you know, getting consent with body language. And she's like, yeah, sure. So being able to kind of just observe those things, try to get close, get consent, and then just letting it happen in front of you. Then luckily Val stepped in and was able to actually get her story, which we needed. But again, I think it's just paying attention and looking at people in the eyes and not just shoving a camera in there, but kind of communicating even if it's not verbally.
Нам сегодня позвонили соседи, которые остались с нами, мне куда выехать. Они сказали, моего дома нет, потому что упал снаряд. Разлетелся полностью мой дом. И у меня квартиры нет, у меня дома нет, куда мне вернуться? Я хочу вывезти ребенка. Все, я больше ничего не хочу. Я хочу, чтобы наши мужчины вернулись сюда и отвоевали землю нашу. Все. Это наш дом.
And there's little moments, like there's a woman who was braiding her hair as they were, you know, getting ready to board the bus, arranging passports. Like those shots take me there in a way that, like, you know, a wide that panned around and saw the scene might not have. And I think like that's stuff we all do, right? Like that's how you get ready for something. And I think I'm just commenting, I guess. It's just like there's something about the way that you can film these that shows not just how sensational and gigantic it is, but how small it really is, how like intimate to someone's life this outrageous experience is.
Sometimes it's those little simple things that you just don't know until you're there. It's like, where do you brush your teeth? Like, where do you go to sleep? How do you make sure that your kid feels safe? How do you take care of your cats? Like little things that become big things when you're fleeing from war. I think sometimes if you concentrate too much on the big things, you lose those little things that make, you know, you and me and the woman braiding her hair equals. Mm-hmm. Madeline said we couldn't cast, right? You can't like make 1,000 phone calls and like have a local producer be like, this is the person, you know, you're going to follow for the next 3 days. You can't do that in a situation like this. So you have to be very open and finding people on the ground, but you also need to commit to some of those people, and because otherwise you're just kind of telling, it's like, you know, too much but not enough of one single story. And so I think you get those moments by committing to one person or one story within this bigger, crazy situation, right?
Yeah, I was struck by how much people were leaving behind, not just like maybe an apartment or a house that was no longer there, but family, like elderly people who couldn't move, and then I suppose the men who were staying behind to fight. Was there Val, this question's for you, like the moment of trying to leave is so fraught with anxiety and adrenaline. Did that palpable sense of loss and leaving people behind come through in the people you were talking to?
to a lot of the people we spoke to, when we asked about who they left behind, there was this sort of like acceptance that this was something that everyone was doing. I often found myself actually very like surprised that it wasn't as like maybe an emotional a question as like I maybe thought it would be. And that's because a lot of them were sort of like, well, I left my husband behind just like every other person you see right here. And I think that sort of, it was like this very, very like quiet trauma. They usually, like the people that we talked to didn't really want to go into detail. It was like a very simple sort of answer, like this is who we left behind. And like, I really hope that we will be back soon.
Madeline, I wanted to ask you about the foreign fighters or people who weren't Ukrainian nationals coming back, going into Poland to fight. You talked to a couple of them. Seems like a pretty extreme move, I guess, for like a non-combatant to get involved. What was it like talking to those folks and like, what did they say?
Yeah, so every day that we were there, we would head to this one train station, which is the first train station in from Ukraine and kind of out from Poland. So like the first and last stop, depending on where you're headed. And so we would see people waiting in line to go back into Ukraine and to fight. Many of those people were Ukrainian men, but we also met two guys, Florian and Hans, who are fighters. One was from Austria and the other was from Norway. And they hadn't met in advance, but had met at this train station to go into Ukraine and to fight. Their idea was basically that they were going to enter Ukraine and find and enlist and like find a translator to help them. I think what was interesting in speaking to them is that we asked them like obviously what had motivated them to decide to go to Ukraine, and a lot of what had motivated them was also like was a motivating factor for us to go to Poland and do the reporting. Like this guy, I remember this guy Florian was like, I was just awake. I was watching the news and I couldn't sleep, and I would go to work and I was exhausted and I couldn't sleep, and I felt like I needed to do something. And I think that's really how we felt while we were trying to get in the field for this project, is that we just needed to do something because the situation felt like so huge and so out of control. They were also telling us about how they had like left their lives behind, and that seemed to be a big part of the story that they were telling too, was like quitting their job, selling all their stuff, saying goodbye to their family members, and how kind of their families really didn't want them to take this big risky move, but they were deciding to do it anyways. There's so much like good press around people going to fight in Ukraine, but it really was a good moment of like taking a step back and seeing like how useful are people who don't speak the language really in going into this country. Like if you are not prepared, you don't have the background, like are you going to be a service to people, or are you going to be a hindrance? So there's definitely like a risk to having people who have never fought before enter into such a heated conflict zone. And it was definitely shocking to talk to people who were about to take this big first step.
I mean, that speaks to kind of that difference, right, of people like me who are here in the United States watching the news, watching this unfold in front of my TV versus people who are there and people who are living it. And I think that lived reality, the represented reality in news, sometimes doesn't necessarily match up, especially when situations are changing, when things are escalating. We're at a point where this conflict is going to change. It's going to get worse. What are you taking away from this experience? Because like, it's huge and it's era defining. And you guys were able to zero in on so many individual stories. Like, how did it change you, or what are you thinking about in the future? I'll start with you, Chica.
So I had this moment when I was there, and there's a lot of cameras there, right? Like it's hard to not have a camera in your shot. Mm-hmm. A lot of the time they are in your shot, as the editor, I'm sure, wasn't happy about. I heard this kid crying, and I wanted the sound. I just wanted the sound within this kind of crowd. And I wasn't filming their face, but somebody there was upset with me that I had kind of turned my camera. And he was like, did you ask for permission? Did you ask for permission? And he was right, I hadn't asked for permission, and I apologized to him. But for me, that was just a reminder of like, ask for consent in whatever way, be respectful. Like, it doesn't matter what situation you're in. Like, you just have to first and foremost treat everyone where you are with respect. Mm-hmm. So that was just like a reminder for me. And even when you're there, you don't know what's going to happen the next day or in a few hours. And just, I mean, for me, it's just hoping that those individual stories will kind of weave the documentation of this moment in history, and hopefully that has value. So that's what I carry with me.
I think it's something that like we as a group talk about a lot because we were on the ground kind of towards the beginning of this refugee crisis, and now we're back and we're just like looking down the timeline of like maybe this will go on for months or maybe years, and it's just like as a person, like I have a really hard time wrapping my head around it. I don't yet have a way to reckon with what's happening over there, and I think that like being there offered a lot of clarity because we were talking to individual people and like getting to know them on an individual level, and I don't have like a sense for how to put what's going on in context because it seems like so awful and so massive. Also, like Val and I both have a lot of like friends in Ukraine or friends who are trying to escape Ukraine, and I think it's both like on a professional level, it's a huge story, and on a personal level, it just feels like deadening, or it feels like very entangled in both parts of myself. Mm-hmm. So I hope that we can continue to like work on it and find like individual stories that break through the noise of it, because I don't really know how to make sense of it otherwise.
Right. And one of the person that you did follow or feature has got on a bus, and you see them on their way, and that would be someone to be like, what is it like living there now? What did you leave behind? Because the story continues, right? Like you were there at a crossing point where a lot of people kind of had to a way station really along this process, but the story still continues. Val, I'll ask you the same question. Like, what are you taking away from this reporting?
I'd like to echo like what both my wonderful colleagues have just said, but I think that like first and foremost, I think my biggest lesson learned is like there is a way of being a witness and a documentarian during such a crisis without being exploitative. And I think that is something that I will work my darndest to do. And I think that the way to do that is like to make sure that you're adding like news value to what you're doing, and you're not like shoving cameras in people's faces as they like walk across a border after, seeing their house blow up. So I think like a commitment to like ethical, documenting of history is like the first thing that I really will take away from this. And then I think that the second is like what everyone has said, which is that like there will be a point when cameras turn away, and I think it is our job to be the camera that comes back and that follows up. And I think that if I could add one third thing, it would be that like seeing the amount of coverage devoted to this, and the amount of just like both like as a journalist, but also like on a personal level, seeing the amount of humanitarian aid offered to these people, I think something that I'll take away is the fact that like that amount of human decency can be offered to many more people. And I think that that's something like to show that this can be done was really impactful. And I think I'm never going to forget that. And as a journalist, I think I'll attempt to cover that in any way I can.
All right, well, thank you guys for this reporting.